We wanted to map out what is the volume, focus, and motivations behind U.S. corporate contributions to education in developing countries. And we surveyed the Fortune 500 companies, and we also identified companies who were not the Fortune 500, but were also heavily engaged in supporting education in developing countries. We surveyed them to see what they were doing, and then we also conducted in-depth interviews with the leaders of corporate philanthropy in these different companies to better understand what their thinking is behind why they're involved in global education. So what we found is that U.S. companies are actually the 7th largest donor to education in developing countries in the aggregate, behind the World Bank and other major donor countries. We estimate that U.S. companies give about $500 million a year to education in developing countries. Education is really at a crossroads in developing countries. We look at the lead-up to the 2015 Millennium Development Goal deadline, and we still have 69 million children out of primary school. In addition, we have hundreds of millions of children enrolled in school, but they're not learning. We have alarming statistics coming out of a lot of countries in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia pointing to inability to master basic skills such as reading and math after several years of schooling. And the third part is we have low transition rates from primary school to secondary school or any type of post-primary education opportunity in developing countries. And we compare education to the global health community, they've been able to mobilize a host of resources from both the public and private sector to support their global goals. And UNESCO estimates that we need an additional $16.2 billion in external resources above what donor governments are giving to education, what national budgets are able to mobilize for education, just to enroll all children in primary school by 2015. So if we look at the health community, they've been able to mobilize $7 billion from the U.S. corporate sector alone to support health in developing countries. Yet if we look at the education sector, there's really no data about what U.S. companies are doing to support education. So when we looked at the contributions that corporations are making to education in developing countries, we really found that there are three main liabilities. They're small in nature, short-termed, and they're relatively uncoordinated. So most companies that make contributions give less than $1 million a year to education. And then, there's another third of companies that actually give $5 million plus and upwards of $30 million in some cases to education in developing countries. But these contributions in our study are spread across 114 different countries, so when you divide it out, they actually are relatively small in scale. They're also short-term. A third of the contributions were one-off contributions, and another third were less than 3 years. And education is a long-term investment. So what we'd really like to see is that companies invest for longer periods of time in these different educational capacities. And the third weakness, I guess, of education philanthropy is that it's relatively uncoordinated. We found that less than 14% of companies were coordinating their contributions with any of the national or local government officials, which is really difficult when you're trying to build an education system in a developing country. We found that 78% of companies make their contributions through nonprofit organizations because they find that they are the people that have the contacts on the ground, that are deeply involved in the education system in these countries. But whenever they're making the contributions on a short term, it's really difficult for the nonprofits to be able to anticipate change and actually create sustainable education pathways. So I think there's a real opportunity here for U.S. companies to maximize their assets, what they bring to corporate philanthropy to education, and minimize some of these liabilities so that they can have a more long-term sustainable impact on education in developing countries and really see a bang for the buck in terms of what education can do for a community and for whether it be the business community or society at large in developing countries. I think one of the key things that companies need to start to do is to look more closely at what's happening in countries in terms of the government's role in education, what their plan is for education, what other major donors are doing in education, and how they can coordinate their contributions so that they're leveraging one another in terms of the unique assets the different donors bring to the table and the priorities within governments themselves.